So the United Nations just made a massive declaration, calling the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. You think that'd be straightforward, right? Well, it was a huge political win for African and Caribbean nations, but former colonial powers in the West pushed back, and they pushed back hard. Today, we're going to break down this incredible global standoff over justice, history, and a debt that some say is in the trillions. Okay, so just look at the results of this UN vote. They were nothing short of dramatic. You can see the split right here. An overwhelming 123 countries voted for the resolution. But then look at the other side. 52 abstained, and that includes the UK and most of the EU. And then there's a tiny handful that voted flat out no. This lopsided result tells you everything you need to know about the deep, complicated fault lines running through this entire conversation. And this sets up this central question we're tackling. How could a resolution that condemns the sheer brutality of slavery, something pretty much everyone agrees was a historical evil, be so darn controversial? Well, the answer is a major clash between what we see as morally right today and what was considered legal way back then. To really get a handle on this clash, let's first look at the argument for justice. For the nations that championed this resolution, led by Ghana and with huge backing from the African Union and Caribbean states, this vote was so much more than just a symbolic nod. At the very heart of the resolution is this incredibly powerful declaration, calling the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. Now, this isn't just strong language for the sake of it. It's a very specific framing. It's meant to acknowledge the unbelievable scale, the centuries of dehumanization, and the economic and social scars that are still very much with us. The delegate from Nicaragua, I think, captured this feeling perfectly. They spoke of a barbarism whose consequences aren't just stuck in history books. And that's really the core of their argument. You can't just treat slavery like some distant event when its legacies, things like systemic racism and economic inequality, are still alive and kicking. And for the Caribbean nations, this vote was never the finish line. Nope, it was explicitly framed as the beginning. A critical first step, as they put it, in a really long process to what they call reparatory justice. A process, by the way, they've been fighting for more than a century. But that big push for justice, it basically slammed into a wall of legal opposition. So now, let's unpack the arguments from those 55 nations that either abstained or voted no. Let's dig into why they resisted the specific wording of this resolution. The opposition really boils down to two main legal arguments. First, they were really worried about creating a hierarchy of crimes. The fear was that if you call slavery the gravest, you might unintentionally make it seem like other horrific atrocities, like the Holocaust, were somehow less significant. Second, and this is a huge principle in international law, is non-retroactivity. Basically, you can't prosecute acts that weren't technically illegal when they happened. And as morally bankrupt as we see slavery today, it wasn't against international law at the time. The UK's ambassador, James Karayuki, stated this hierarchy argument really clearly. His point was that we should treat all historical injustices with the same level of seriousness, and that creating some kind of ranking risks a competition against historic tragedies, which doesn't help any victim's memory. Now, while 52 countries decided to abstain, only 3 voted outright no. And honestly, this is one of the most surprising parts of the whole thing. The U.S. argued that the resolution created that hierarchy, but also, and this is key, that it objected to using historical wrongs as a leverage point to reallocate modern resources. And that phrase, reallocate modern resources, brings us right to the massive, staggering financial figures that are hanging over this entire debate. Because when you strip away the legal and moral arguments, this is fundamentally a conversation about money. A lot of money. So this brings up a really fascinating and kind of wild historical question. When slavery was finally abolished, who do you think actually got paid reparations? The answer is pretty shocking. Reparations were paid not to the people who were enslaved, but to these slave owners for the loss of their so-called property. In the 1830s, the British government paid them the equivalent of over $21 billion in today's money. Okay, now let's compare that to the numbers being talked about today. While those past payments went to the enslavers, modern estimates for what's owed to the descendants of the enslaved are, well, they're astronomical. One judge at the International Court of Justice calculated a potential figure of $107 trillion. That's trillion with a T. It's a number so huge, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around, and it shows you just how tough this financial conversation really is. So some countries are trying to find a kind of middle ground. The Netherlands, for example, became the only European nation to issue a formal apology, But, and it's a big but, they explicitly ruled out direct financial reparations. Instead, they created a $230 million fund for social and educational programs to deal with the legacy of slavery. And, even within nations that might be sympathetic to the idea, the political reality is just incredibly complex. Think about it. America's first black president, Barack Obama, said just before he left office that he believed the political system in the U.S. made actually implementing reparations practically unworkable. That just highlights the immense hurdles at home. So, all of this brings us to the big, so what question. If the UN resolution isn't legally binding and the financial and political roadblocks are so massive, what did this vote actually accomplish? Well, the answer is, it created a powerful new precedent. Here is the absolute crucial takeaway. While this resolution can't force any country to write a check, it fundamentally changes the global conversation. What it does is give official, UN-backed political legitimacy to the entire movement for reparatory justice, and that pushes it from the fringes right into the mainstream. And that legitimacy has real, concrete, forward-looking goals. It's designed to add some serious weight to campaigns that are demanding formal apologies for more countries. It strengthens the argument for returning stolen cultural artifacts that are currently sitting in Western museums. And, crucially, it lays the groundwork for future, more formal negotiations over financial reparations, even if that's a process that takes decades. The president of Ghana, who was a key architect of this resolution, really summarized its intended meaning perfectly. For all the nations that voted yes, this was about marking a moment in history, a moment where the world's biggest international body formally acknowledged an ancient and incredibly enduring injustice. So this vote has drawn a brand new line in the sand. It's created a powerful moral and political precedent. But the massive question remains, will all this new pressure be enough to overcome centuries of history and the immense legal and financial barriers to reparatory justice? I guess only time will tell.